What happens when a teenage boy takes his own father to court, demanding the support he believes he's owed? For years, Ethan Carter struggled alone, convinced his father, Jonathan, had abandoned him. No financial help, no contact, just silence. Desperate for justice, Ethan files a lawsuit, ready to expose the truth. But when the trial begins, shocking revelations shake the courtroom to its core. A hidden letter, a buried secret, a truth that changes everything Ethan thought he knew about his past. This isn't just a legal battle, it's a fight for answers, for closure, and for a bond that might already be broken beyond repair. Will Ethan finally get the justice he seeks, or will the truth leave him questioning everything? Stay with us until the very end of this gripping story. You won't believe the final twist. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The courtroom was silent. All eyes were on the young man standing behind the plaintiff's desk. Ethan Carter, just 17, stared at his father across the courtroom floor with determination. His voice was firm, unwavering. My father has failed to support me financially. For 5 years, I have received nothing from him. Across the court, Jonathan Carter, a man in his late 40s with sharp blue eyes and a confident posture, did not flinch. He leaned slightly forward, gripping the wooden edge of his courtroom table. I have never abandoned my responsibility, Jonathan stated calmly. My son is being manipulated by someone with an agenda. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge, an elderly man with silver hair and piercing eyes, lifted a hand to silence the whispers. Mr. Carter, are you denying that you have not paid for your son's tuition and living expenses? The judge asked. I am saying, Jonathan replied, his voice steady, that the truth is more complicated than it appears. The prosecutor smirked. If that is the case, Mr. Carter, I am sure you will not object to your son presenting his evidence. Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it on the courtroom table and flipped through the pages before handing them to his attorney. These are my birth certificate and bank records, Ethan declared. My birth certificate proves Jonathan Carter is my biological father. My bank records show that I have received no financial support from him in 5 years. The evidence was passed to the judge. The tension in the court grew heavier. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed outside the courtroom doors. This was more than just a family dispute, it was a case that would soon capture national attention. But as Ethan's attorney continued his arguments, Jonathan Carter remained oddly calm. A small smirk formed at the corner of his lips. You are a smart boy, Jonathan said suddenly, his voice filled with something almost like amusement. But you have forgotten one very important detail. Ethan frowned. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Carter, what detail are you referring to? Jonathan's attorney stood and handed the judge a sealed envelope. Your Honor, this is a letter written by Ethan's mother before her passing. I request that it be read aloud. Ethan's heart pounded. His mother had died 10 years ago. What could she have written that was relevant now? The judge opened the envelope, unfolding the paper with careful hands. He cleared his throat and began reading. To my son Ethan, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means the truth has come to light. I have hidden something from you all these years to protect you. The man you call your father, Jonathan Carter, is not your biological father. The courtroom erupted. Ethan felt the world spin around him. His grip tightened on the table as murmurs filled the air. Order, the judge commanded, slamming his gavel. Silence in the court. Ethan turned to his father, the man he had called his father, and saw that Jonathan was still watching him with the same unreadable expression. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal battles. It was now a battlefield of buried secrets, broken trust, and unexpected truths. And Ethan was at the center of it all. The courtroom was still in shock. Ethan Carter stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had come here to demand justice, to force his father to take responsibility. But now a letter from his deceased mother had just shattered everything he believed. Jonathan Carter is not your biological father. The words echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. It couldn't be true. His entire life, he had known only one father. If this was a lie, then who was he? The judge set the letter down and turned to Jonathan. Mr. Carter, is this information accurate? Jonathan inhaled slowly. That is what I was led to believe. After my wife's passing, I discovered this letter among her things. It was devastating, Your Honor. I was a grieving husband, suddenly faced with the possibility that the boy I had raised was not my own. Ethan clenched his fists. You're lying, he snapped. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the turmoil within him. You just want an excuse to avoid taking responsibility. Jonathan, remain calm. If that were true, why did I continue to raise you for years after your mother's death? The courtroom fell silent. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jonathan's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we anticipated this reaction, which is why we have additional evidence. He slid a file across the courtroom table. We conducted a DNA test. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. The judge accepted the document and read it. After a long pause, he looked up. According to this report, Ethan Carter is biologically related to Jonathan Carter. Gasps rippled through the courtroom once again. Ethan gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. Jonathan finally looked directly at Ethan, his voice softer than before. Your mother lied to both of us. Ethan's head spun. Why would his mother do this? Had she really wanted to hide the truth? And if so, why? The judge turned to Ethan's lawyer. Does the plaintiff wish to proceed with the lawsuit, given this new evidence? Ethan hesitated. His mind screamed at him to demand an explanation, to force Jonathan to answer for the years of neglect. But his lawyer spoke first. Your Honor, my client was led to believe that his father abandoned him financially. Whether or not Mr. Carter is his biological parent, the question remains, did he fail in his legal obligation to support his son? Jonathan sighed. I never abandoned him. Ethan scoffed. That's easy to say, when you haven't sent me a single cent in years. Jonathan exchanged a glance with his lawyer before speaking again. I never sent you direct payments, Ethan, but I set up a fund in your mother's name. That fund has more than enough money to cover your education and living expenses. The courtroom filled with murmurs. Ethan's mind reeled. What fund? Jonathan's lawyer handed over a document. The money has been in an account under the supervision of a third party, your former teacher, Mrs. Anderson. Ethan's jaw clenched. Mrs. Anderson had always looked after him, but she had never once mentioned anything about a fund. The judge frowned. Is Mrs. Anderson present in the court today? A quiet voice spoke from the back of the courtroom. I am. Ethan turned. Mrs. Anderson, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, stepped forward. Is this true? The judge asked her. She nodded, guilt flashing across her face. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Carter entrusted me with the money, but I never told Ethan. I thought I was protecting him. Ethan's breath caught. Everyone had been lying to him. His mother, his father, even Mrs. Anderson. Protecting me? He repeated, his voice bitter. She hesitated. I feared that if you knew where the money came from, you would reject it out of anger. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Everything was spiraling out of control. He had come here to fight for what was his, but now the courtroom felt like a maze of betrayals and hidden truths. And the worst part? He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Ethan's fingers dug into the polished surface of the courtroom table. His head spun with the weight of what he had just learned. A fund in his mother's name. Money that had been hidden from him. People he trusted keeping secrets. His voice was cold when he finally spoke. You thought you were protecting me? He turned to Mrs. Anderson, his old teacher, his supposed guardian. You lied to me. Mrs. Anderson shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Ethan, I only did what I believed was best for you. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd refuse the money out of pride. Ethan let out a sharp laugh, the sound bitter. Pride? He shook his head. I struggled for years. I skipped meals, took extra shifts at work, nearly dropped out of school, while all along there was a fund sitting there untouched. His voice rose, anger spilling into the courtroom. And you never once thought to tell me? The judge rapped his gavel. Order in the court. Ethan exhaled shakily, forcing himself to regain control. The whole courtroom was watching, journalists, spectators, even the legal team for both sides. He couldn't afford to break down now. His lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, while it is clear that financial provisions were made, the question remains, was the plaintiff wrongfully denied access to the funds? He turned to Mrs. Anderson. Ma'am, under what legal authority did you withhold this money from Ethan? Mrs. Anderson hesitated before answering. Mr. Carter gave me full control over disbursements. He trusted me to determine when Ethan was mature enough to use the money wisely. Ethan's nails pressed into his palms. And what gave you the right to make that decision for me? Jonathan finally spoke, his voice steady. She wasn't alone in that choice. I made it too. Ethan snapped his head toward him. Of course you did. His words dripped with resentment. Another decision about my life made without me. Jonathan met his gaze without flinching. I wasn't abandoning you, Ethan. I wanted you to have security, even if you didn't know it. I thought the best way to ensure that was to keep the money away from you until you were ready. Ethan's frustration boiled over. You don't get to decide when I'm ready. You don't get to disappear for years and then act like you did me a favor. The courtroom murmured in agreement. Even the judge looked contemplative. Jonathan's lawyer raised a hand. Your Honor, while I understand Ethan's frustration, we must acknowledge that his tuition and expenses were accounted for, even if not in the way he expected. Mr. Carter is not legally obligated to pay funds directly to his son, only to ensure his financial well-being. The judge nodded slowly. That is true. However, the court must also consider whether the withholding of these funds caused unnecessary hardship. He turned to Mrs. Anderson. Ma'am, did you ever intend to give Ethan access to the money? Mrs. Anderson's expression darkened with guilt. Yes. When he turned 18. Ethan clenched his jaw. And what if I hadn't taken my father to court? Would I ever have found out? Mrs. Anderson looked away. I don't know. Jonathan sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. This is not how I wanted things to go. Ethan scoffed. Oh, really? Because from where I'm standing, this is exactly how you planned it. Jonathan's lawyer cleared his throat. Your Honor, given that Ethan now has full access to his funds, we move to dismiss the case. Ethan stiffened. Was that it? After everything, they were just going to brush it under the rug? His own lawyer spoke up. Your Honor, my client is still seeking accountability for the emotional distress caused by these actions. The question remains, if this fund existed, why was he left to struggle alone? Why was he made to believe he was abandoned? The judge nodded. A fair question. He turned back to Jonathan. Mr. Carter, do you have an answer? Jonathan sighed, then finally said, because I wasn't sure if Ethan was my son. The courtroom erupted once more. Ethan felt like the floor had just been ripped from under him. Jonathan's voice was heavy as he continued. After my wife's death, I found the letter she left behind. For years, I didn't know what to believe. I thought maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe I had no right to interfere in Ethan's life. So I kept my distance. Ethan's breath came short and uneven. So you just what? Left me in limbo? Neither a father nor a stranger. Jonathan's eyes darkened with regret. I thought I was doing the right thing. But maybe I was just a coward. For the first time, Ethan saw something real in his father's no, in Jonathan's expression. He saw doubt. He saw pain. The judge took a deep breath. We will take a brief recess, before I make my ruling." As the gavel slammed down, Ethan didn't move. His hands were shaking. Because, for the first time in this courtroom, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to win. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, but Ethan barely heard it. His mind swirled with everything Jonathan had just admitted. His father, no. Jonathan had doubted him for years. He had watched from a distance, holding onto a fortune meant for Ethan while letting him believe he was abandoned. And all because of a letter. Ethan sat frozen at the plaintiff's table while reporters whispered furiously, scribbling notes on their legal pads. The recess had barely begun, but the court was still alive with speculation. Some people looked at Jonathan with sympathy, understanding his hesitation. Others, like Ethan, saw only betrayal. His lawyer leaned in. "We still have a strong case. Emotional distress, financial hardship, failure to communicate legal matters." Ethan barely heard him. His eyes locked onto Jonathan across the courtroom, where he sat hunched over, fingers laced together. He looked exhausted, but Ethan couldn't find it in himself to care. The door to the judge's chamber opened. "All rise," the bailiff called, bringing the courtroom back to attention. The judge returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. "This case presents a unique situation," he began, adjusting his glasses. "On one hand, Mr. Carter did not fail in his financial obligations. The fund existed, and it was sufficient to support the plaintiff. On the other hand, the withholding of such information caused the plaintiff unnecessary hardship and emotional distress. The court must decide whether this constitutes negligence." Ethan's fingers curled into his palms. The judge turned toward Jonathan. "Mr. Carter, I ask you directly, why did you choose not to tell your son about the fund once he was old enough to understand?" Jonathan inhaled deeply. "Because I didn't know if I had the right to interfere in his life. I believed my wife's letter, and by the time I considered telling him, too much time had passed. I thought maybe he was better off without me." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Ethan's frustration boiled over. He shot up from his seat. "Better off?" His voice cracked. "I wasn't better off. I worked double shifts at a gas station while my friends applied for college. I worried every day if I could afford rent. Meanwhile, you knew I was struggling, and he exhaled sharply. "You just let it happen?" Jonathan didn't flinch, but his jaw tensed. "I made a mistake." "That's not a mistake," Ethan said bitterly. "That's abandonment." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Carter, given the circumstances, do you believe you owe your son more than just the money you set aside?" Jonathan looked down for a long moment. When he finally met Ethan's gaze, his expression was unreadable. "Yes." Ethan's breath caught. He hadn't expected that answer. Jonathan turned back to the judge. "If Ethan will allow it, I'd like to formally transfer control of the fund to him. No restrictions. No third parties. It belongs to him, and he should decide what to do with it." Ethan blinked, taken aback. He hadn't thought that Jonathan would give up control so easily. It almost felt like an apology. But before he could respond, another voice spoke. "Your Honor," Sophie said, standing from her seat in the back. "I would like to make a statement." The courtroom erupted once more. Ethan felt a fresh wave of anger rise in his chest. "Not now." "Not her." The judge sighed but nodded. "Approach the stand." Sophie walked slowly to the front, her heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor. When she turned to face Ethan, her eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite place. Guilt? Regret? She cleared her throat. "I was the one who convinced Ethan to take this to court," she admitted. "I showed him documents that made it seem like his father had completely abandoned him. I wanted him to fight for what was his." Jonathan's lawyer crossed his arms. "And why would you do that?" Sophie hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "Because I thought if he won, we could take the money and leave together." Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "You what?" Sophie swallowed hard. "I didn't plan on hurting you, Ethan. I wanted us to have a future. I thought if you had the money, we could go somewhere else." Start over. Jonathan's lawyer stepped forward. Did you manipulate Ethan into believing that his father had truly abandoned him? Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Ethan's breath left him all at once. He had fought so hard in this courtroom, convinced that Jonathan was the villain. But now, he wasn't sure who had betrayed him more, his father for withholding the truth, or Sophie for twisting it into something even worse. The judge exhaled and looked at Ethan. Son, given these new developments, do you still wish to pursue the case? Ethan felt all eyes on him. The weight of the courtroom, the trial, the past, it was suffocating. He glanced at Jonathan, at Mrs. Anderson, at Sophie. Then, finally, he took a deep breath. I don't know yet. The judge nodded. Then, this court will reconvene tomorrow for a final decision. As the gavel struck, Ethan turned away from Sophie and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Ethan pushed through the heavy courtroom doors and stepped into the cold afternoon air. The chaos inside, the murmurs, the reporters, the glares from strangers faded into a dull hum. He needed space. He needed air. His world had turned upside down in a matter of hours. Jonathan had lied. Mrs. Anderson had lied. And worst of all, Sophie, the one person he had trusted most, had manipulated him for her own gain. He leaned against a stone pillar outside the courthouse, his breath shaky. Was this what justice felt like? Because it didn't feel like winning. It felt like losing everything all at once. Ethan? He turned to see Jonathan standing at the bottom of the steps, hands in his pockets. For the first time, the man looked uncertain, vulnerable. Ethan crossed his arms. What do you want? Jonathan exhaled. Just to talk. Ethan scoffed. Talk? You had years to do that. You could have talked when Mom died. You could have talked when I was skipping meals to save money. You could have talked before I had to drag you into a courtroom just to get answers. Jonathan flinched, but didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low. You're right. Ethan blinked. He had expected excuses, not agreement. Jonathan ran a hand through his graying hair. I was a coward. I let doubt control me. And when I finally realized the truth, I didn't know how to fix it. I thought staying away was better than coming back too late. Ethan clenched his jaw. That wasn't your choice to make. Jonathan nodded slowly. No, it wasn't. He looked at Ethan, then really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. I failed you, and I can't change the past. But if you'll let me, I want to try and make things right now. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to lash out. But part of him, just a small, fragile part, wanted to believe him. Before he could respond, the courthouse doors swung open again. Sophie. Her face was pale, her eyes pleading. Ethan, please let me explain. He turned away. I think you've explained enough. She stepped forward. I never meant to hurt you. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. That's funny because it sure felt like you did. Sophie's voice cracked. I was scared, okay? I saw you struggling, and I thought if we could win this case, we'd have a future. I didn't know about the fund. I thought Jonathan had really abandoned you. Ethan turned, eyes blazing. So instead of asking me what I wanted, you lied. You stole documents. You pushed me into a lawsuit I might not have needed. Sophie's face crumbled. I just wanted us to have a life together. Ethan's throat tightened. He had loved her. Or at least he had thought he had. But love wasn't supposed to feel like betrayal. Jonathan cleared his throat. Ethan, whatever you decide, you don't have to do it now. Ethan stared at them both, his father and the girl who had once meant everything to him. I need time, he said finally. From both of you. Jonathan nodded in understanding. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving them behind on the courthouse steps. Tomorrow, he would return to the courtroom for a final decision. But tonight, he needed to figure out if he was ready to forgive. Ethan barely slept that night. The weight of everything, Jonathan's confession, Mrs. Anderson's deception, Sophie's betrayal pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. No matter how many times he turned it over in his mind, he couldn't make sense of it all. Morning came too quickly, and before he knew it, he was back in the courtroom, facing the people who had shaped his life in ways he never understood until now. The judge entered, bringing the court to order. We are here to determine whether Mr. Jonathan Carter bears legal responsibility for withholding financial information from his son, and whether the emotional distress caused justifies damages. Ethan's lawyer stood. Your Honor, the evidence shows that while a fund was set aside, Mr. Carter deliberately withheld this knowledge from my client, leading to unnecessary hardship. Ethan suffered financially, mentally, and emotionally under the false belief that his father had abandoned him. The court must decide whether this constitutes negligence. Jonathan's attorney countered, Your Honor, my client's actions were misguided, but they were not malicious. He provided for his son through a legal trust. The issue here is not whether Mr. Carter failed in his duties, but whether his decision to keep this information private warrants legal action. Ethan barely listened. His mind was already made up. The judge turned to him. Mr. Carter, do you wish to proceed with the lawsuit? Ethan stood slowly, every eye in the courtroom locked onto him. He looked at Jonathan, then at Sophie. Both were waiting for his decision. For the past 5 years, he had carried nothing but anger. It had driven him, kept him moving forward. But now standing here, facing the truth, he felt exhausted. I don't want the money, he said finally. The courtroom murmured. That's not why I brought this to court. I wanted answers. And now I have them. His lawyer's brow furrowed. Ethan, are you sure? He nodded. Yes. He turned to Jonathan. You say you want to fix things. You say you regret what you did. Prove it. Jonathan's expression softened. How? Ethan inhaled deeply. Be my father. Not just in name, not just in legal obligations. If you really mean it, if you're really sorry, then start acting like it. A hush fell over the courtroom. For a long moment, Jonathan didn't speak. Then, finally, he nodded. I will. The judge tapped his gavel. Very well. Given the plaintiff's decision, this court dismisses the case. Ethan let out a slow breath as the tension in the room shifted. It was over. The fight, the anger, the legal battle, it was all over. As the courtroom emptied, Jonathan approached him carefully. Ethan turned. Jonathan hesitated. Would you maybe want to get coffee? Talk. Ethan considered him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I think I would. As they left the courthouse together, for the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to hope. Ethan sat across from Jonathan in a small cafe, just a few blocks from the courthouse. The weight of the dismissed case still lingered between them, like a shadow neither of them could shake. The tension had followed them from the courtroom, settling heavily in the space between their coffee cups. Jonathan stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, watching Ethan with quiet hesitation. I wasn't sure you'd actually agree to this, he admitted. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. Honestly, neither was I. Jonathan nodded, as if he understood. And maybe he did. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, but not hostile. It was simply there, a quiet reminder of the years that had stretched between them, filled with resentment and unanswered questions. Ethan finally broke the silence. What was she like? Jonathan looked up, startled. Who? My mother, Ethan said, his voice softer than before. The version you knew, before she wrote that letter. Jonathan's expression shifted, his features relaxing into something almost nostalgic. She was stubborn, he said with a small smile. Smart. The kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. And she loved you. More than anything. Ethan swallowed the lump forming in his throat. Then why did she lie? Jonathan sighed, setting his spoon down. I don't know for sure. I think she was scared. Maybe she worried that my family's money would complicate things. Or maybe she thought I wouldn't stay if I found out. He paused. But I did stay, and I would have, no matter what. Ethan's chest tightened. Then why didn't you fight for me? Jonathan flinched slightly, but he didn't look away. Because I was a coward. He exhaled. I let doubt get the better of me, and when I finally wanted to reach out, too much time had passed. I told myself you were better off without me, but the truth is I was afraid you'd never forgive me. Ethan studied him carefully. For years, he had built up an image of Jonathan in his head, a cold, distant man who had walked away without a second thought. But sitting here now, watching him wrestle with regret, Ethan wasn't sure that image was entirely accurate. Maybe Jonathan hadn't been absent because he didn't care. Maybe he had stayed away because he cared too much. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. I don't know if I can forgive you, he admitted. Not yet. Jonathan nodded, accepting that. That's fair. But, Ethan added, his voice hesitant, I guess this is a start. A flicker of relief crossed Jonathan's face. Yeah, it is. They fell into silence again, but this time it felt different. Less like a void and more like something being rebuilt slowly, uncertainly, but rebuilt nonetheless. Ethan glanced toward the courthouse, still visible in the distance. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the place where he had fought for something he lost. It felt like the place where he had found something unexpected, a chance to understand, a chance to heal, a chance to take the first step. The cafe had emptied out a bit, the lunch rush fading into a quieter hum of conversation. Ethan traced the rim of his coffee cup, his mind tangled in the aftermath of the courtroom battle. Across from him, Jonathan sat patiently, as if waiting for Ethan to set the pace of their conversation. Ethan finally spoke. What happened after Mom died? His voice was steady, but underneath, a lifetime of unspoken pain lingered. Jonathan exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself. I tried at first, he admitted. I tried to stay in your life, to be the father you needed. But then I found the letter, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about you, about our family, was in question. Ethan clenched his jaw. So you just gave up? Jonathan met his gaze directly. I let my doubts win, he said honestly. I told myself it would be better for you to grow up without me in the way. That's why I set up the fund, to make sure you'd have everything you needed, even if I wasn't there. Ethan scoffed. Yeah? Well, it didn't feel like I had everything I needed. Jonathan's expression tightened with guilt. I know. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Ethan studied him, looking for insincerity, for some sign that Jonathan was just saying what he thought Ethan wanted to hear. But he found none. There was only honesty, raw and unfiltered. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple. I spent years thinking you didn't care, that you had just erased me from your life. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. I never erased you. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone, swiping through something before setting it down in front of Ethan. Ethan frowned and looked down. It was a photo, one taken from a distance, clearly not meant to be seen. It was him, at his part-time job, stocking shelves at a grocery store. Ethan's stomach twisted. What is this? Jonathan cleared his throat. I checked in on you sometimes. I never wanted you to know. I thought it would just make things harder. But I needed to know you were okay. Ethan stared at the image, something inside him breaking apart and reshaping all at once. He had spent so long believing Jonathan had vanished from his life without a second thought. And yet, here was proof that he had been watching over him all along. It didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the hurt. But it complicated things. Ethan pushed the phone back toward Jonathan. You had all this time, he said quietly. You could have reached out. You could have just told me the truth. Jonathan nodded. I know. He ran a hand through his graying hair. That's the thing about mistakes. You don't always realize how badly you've screwed up until it's too late. Ethan let out a breath, staring down at his untouched coffee. I don't know how to fix this. Jonathan offered a small, sad smile. Neither do I. But I'd like to try. If you'll let me. Ethan looked up, meeting his father's eyes. There was hesitation, doubt, and lingering resentment inside him. But there was also something else, a tiny ember of hope. You can start by showing up, Ethan said finally. Not just today. Not just because of the court case. But for real. Jonathan nodded. I will. For the first time in years, Ethan believed him. Ethan wasn't sure what he expected after that conversation in the cafe. Maybe nothing. Maybe Jonathan would vanish again, retreat into the distance like he had for years. But 2 days later, he received a text. Jonathan, would you like to have dinner? No pressure. Just an invitation. Ethan stared at the message longer than he should have. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let his anger win. But another part, the part that had agreed to meet in the first place, told him to give it a chance. So he responded. Ethan, yeah. Where? The restaurant was quiet, tucked into a corner of the city Ethan rarely visited. It was small, nothing fancy, just a place with warm lighting and the smell of home-cooked meals drifting through the air. Jonathan was already there when Ethan arrived, a nervous energy about him. He stood as Ethan approached, hesitating before motioning to the seat across from him. I wasn't sure if you'd come. Ethan sat, crossing his arms. Neither was I. A small, knowing smile flickered across Jonathan's face before he signaled for the waiter. They ordered, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. Not quite comfortable, but not entirely hostile either. Jonathan cleared his throat. So, how's school? Ethan arched an eyebrow. Seriously? Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know where to start. I figured school was safe. Ethan sighed, leaning back. I don't know. It's fine, I guess. Or it will be, if I can figure out what's next. Jonathan nodded slowly. I want to help. With college or anything else. Ethan stiffened. I don't need your money. Jonathan held up a hand. I'm not just talking about money. He hesitated. I want to be there for you, Ethan. However that looks. Ethan studied him, searching for the familiar coldness he had come to expect. But it wasn't there. Jonathan wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't trying to erase what had happened. He was just trying. Ethan let out a slow breath. I don't know how to do this. Jonathan's lips curled into a sad smile. Me neither. Silence settled between them, but this time, it wasn't tense. It was uncertain, maybe even a little hopeful. The waiter arrived with their food, setting their plates down with a polite nod before walking away. Jonathan glanced at Ethan's plate. You still don't eat. Tomatoes, huh? Ethan blinked. What? Jonathan motioned toward his plate. You used to pick them out of your sandwiches as a kid. Said they ruined the whole thing. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then slowly shook his head, an amused scoff escaping his lips. You remember that? Jonathan gave a small shrug. I remember a lot of things. Ethan didn't know why, but that single sentence did something to him. It cracked something open just a little. They ate in relative silence after that, but it wasn't awkward. It was something different, something that felt like the beginning of something new. As they finished their meal, Jonathan cleared his throat. Would it be okay if I came to one of your baseball games? Ethan hesitated. His instinct was to shut the idea down, to say no, to push Jonathan away before he could disappear again. But something stopped him. He thought about all the times he had played without anyone in the stands for him. How much he had hated looking up and seeing nothing. Maybe it was time to change that. Ethan nodded. Yeah, that'd be okay. Jonathan's smile was small, but genuine. As they left the restaurant, Ethan realized something strange. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was walking away from his father. He felt like he was walking toward him. Ethan stood in the dugout, gripping his baseball glove as the sounds of the stadium echoed around him. The evening air carried the familiar sense of fresh-cut grass and worn leather. But tonight, something felt different. He wasn't just playing another game. He was playing in front of his father. His eyes drifted toward the bleachers, scanning the crowd until he found him. Jonathan sat near the middle, dressed casually in a navy jacket, watching with a quiet intensity. It was strange. Ethan had played in dozens of games, but never with his father in the stands. A few days ago, he would have told himself it didn't matter. But now, standing here, he knew it did. The sharp whistle of the umpire snapped him back to reality. "Carter, you're up." Ethan exhaled slowly, stepping onto the field. He adjusted his grip on the bat, shaking out his nerves. The pitcher eyed him carefully before winding up. The ball came faster than he expected, but he was ready. With a solid crack, the bat connected, sending the ball soaring over the field. The crowd erupted in cheers as he sprinted toward first base, then second. As he slid into third, the dust kicked up around him, and when he finally looked up, his eyes found Jonathan's again. He was smiling. After the game, Ethan walked toward the parking lot, his jersey still damp with sweat. He hadn't expected Jonathan to stay, but there he was, leaning against his car. "Nice hit," Jonathan said as Ethan approached. Ethan smirked. "You sound surprised." Jonathan chuckled. "Not surprised, just impressed." They stood there for a moment, the stadium lights casting long shadows around them. Ethan kicked at a loose pebble on the pavement. "You didn't have to come, you know." Jonathan nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "But I wanted to." Ethan studied him carefully. The man standing in front of him wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, big ones. And Ethan wasn't sure if he could ever fully erase the anger, the pain of the past. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that Jonathan had shown up, that he had sat through the game, watched every play, and stayed until the end. Maybe that was the first step. Ethan took a deep breath. "Do you want to grab something to eat?" Jonathan's expression flickered with surprise, then something softer. "Yeah, I'd like that." They got into the car, pulling out of the parking lot together. For years, Ethan had carried the weight of abandonment, of anger, of feeling like he had to fight the world alone. But as they drove through the quiet streets, he realized something. Maybe he wasn't alone anymore. Maybe he never really had been. Life isn't always about winning or losing, it's about understanding, forgiving, and moving forward. Ethan's journey in the courtroom wasn't just about money. It was about uncovering the truth, healing old wounds, and giving second chances. What did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to decide between holding on to anger or letting go? Let us know in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know. Drop your country in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. See you in the next video. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.